Ladies and gentlemen, please find your seats. Our program is about to begin, and at this time, please be sure to silence all cell phones. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Dr. Gordon Lloyd.
Excellent. Before we get started, I'm going to invite our partners for this evening, Rosemary and Beatrice, to stand up and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. So please rise.
Pledge to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You may be seated. Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for coming tonight. My name is Tony Penny. I'm the Chief Learning Officer here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. It's my honor to sit here and be in conversation with Dr. Lloyd, a man I consider a good friend and likely one of the smartest people I know. Someone who knows more about the founding of this country likely than anyone but the people who were actually there. We've had many conversations. I think this is our 11th year of having a lecture featuring Dr. Lloyd. In fact, when I first started here, one of the very first people I reached out to learn a little bit about how I should do my job well was Dr. Lloyd. I'm privileged and honored to have you joining us here tonight.
Well, I'm glad to be around for the 11th. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And again, I want to thank Beatrice and Rosemary. They are responsible for the lovely reception and the food and the drink that you had before a gathering. So thank you so much. It's been wonderful to work with you many years putting this event together, and the work you do to promote the Constitution, to invite students to this event is always very much appreciated. So thank you, ladies, both very much. So I want to start off. So America is very interested in the anniversaries of things.
Yes.
So if we look just recently, we just had the 20th anniversary of the terrible events of 9/11. Here at the foundation, it is simultaneously the 30th anniversary of the opening of the library, the 40th anniversary of President Reagan's first year in office, the 100th anniversary of Nancy Reagan's birth. So we're celebrating all sorts of anniversaries here this year. And of course, we're coming up on the 234th anniversary of the Constitution of the United States. So my first question to you is, we're here today to talk about Constitution Day. It's an event, it's happening this Friday. So why is the Constitution, why is it worth remembering? Why is it worth celebrating? Why should people today still be interested and think about and celebrate something that happened that long ago?
Well, if you don't celebrate it on the day, you're not going to celebrate it at all. And if you forget your mother's birthday, then you're in big trouble. And so what I'm trying, you know, a lot of things happen in life by accident. And once upon a time, there was no such thing as Constitution Day. There was sort of Citizenship Day, and it happened around World War II. And it was really to commemorate immigrants and to be sort of an assimilation exercise in which immigrants and the American people, you natural born Americans would mingle together. And then it turned into Citizenship Day. And then as a lot of things happen in America, there may be no good abstract reason for it. But Senator Byrd from West Virginia, who has a lot of things named after him in West Virginia, he decided that he would, in an omnibus bill in the Senate, he would slip in a measure. If he wanted his vote, he'd slip in a measure which says every single school or educational institution which receives federal funds must in some sense honor the Constitution. So it became Constitution Day. No federal holiday, but it came into being by that kind of process. No one just sat down and said, there has to be a Constitution Day like Declaration of Independence, July the 4th, such and such, it comes anniversary. It sort of meandered in to now that we have it. But then, so that's why Constitution Day becomes, because of Senator Byrd. And I remember the first Constitution Day, so that's 21st century. And I remember the first Constitution Day address that I was at. One of the people giving a lecture, the title of the paper was, is Constitution Day constitutional? Now, and that shows you why we need Constitution Day, to answer your question directly without going into all kinds of, but it is a very good question, because we remember Veterans Day, we remember Memorial Day, we remember Mother's Day, we remember Grandparents' Day. This week apparently was Grandparents' Day. But why Constitution Day? Well, let me put it after that sort of meandering. Let me get to the point. What is a constitution supposed to do? It's supposed to lay down or constitute the basic principles and rules by which we are supposed to govern ourselves. And our Constitution is made for the deliberative process. Other countries have constitutions, but what is the point? It can be altered at any time. So the Constitution actually lays down the principles and guidelines of it, how we're about to go and do things. So there are rules of the game, and one of the rules is you play fair. You can play nasty, but you have to play fair. And you have to remember that there's been a lot of nastiness. It's not only today that we've had a lot of disputes. Disputes from the very beginning. But there's one thing that strikes me about Constitution Day to remember. Despite all the arguments that went on then, despite all the arguments that have continued since, not a drop of blood was spilt except once, which was the Civil War. But the creation of the Constitution had never been done before in the history of the world, and not a drop of blood was spilt. Now, that seems to me to be something to commemorate and remember. That we can argue, and when I came to America, I always say, look, these people are just going at each other on the stage, and right at the end, they shake hands. I mean, what was that, a farce? No, it's part of this. You fight hard and you shake hands. I think of baseball, football, hockey. You know, you play hard, and at the end, you shake hands. And so I think that's something that we need to remember. Despite our differences, we must be able to shake hands at the end and say, wait till next year.
Oh, great answer. So here, a follow-up question for you. So with these other holidays that we celebrate, these kind of innately American holidays, on Veterans Day, we know how to we pay tribute. We think about veterans, right? We'll put a flag up or go to a ceremony where a veteran's speaking, or visit, like a cemetery or something like that, right? 4th of July, we think of the Declaration of Independence. We think of barbecues and parades and fireworks and that sort of thing. I'll wager that most people don't have anything that immediately comes to mind when they think about how should I celebrate Constitution Day. So I'm going to make you the czar of holidays and celebrations. That's your czar music. We're ordaining you right now.
That courtesy of Gino.
So you now have been ordained the czar of holidays and celebrations. How should people celebrate Constitution Day? What should they think of? What sort of civic rituals should take place on a holiday like this?
All right.
Uh-oh.
I'm going down the street. What do you want? Moderation. When do you want it? Now and again. Now, how can you celebrate that? There's no fireworks. right? So Constitution Day is about boring things. It's about just talking through matters, agreeing, compromising. Senator Byrd putting something in an omnibus bill. It seems like just talking, and there's nothing to celebrate. I mean, there's no fireworks, there's no action. It's just moderation. So how can you celebrate moderation? So I'm the czar. And you say, well, you can't celebrate moderation, except perhaps drink in moderation. You know, if you want to celebrate, right? So I mean, it's extremely difficult to come up with fireworks for the Constitution because it had 88 days was created, but you had to compromise. People got tough with each other. They got upset, but they came back to the table because they wanted to get things done. So it's a sense of, can you celebrate the deliberative process? You're not going to get, look, the world is not perfect. The answers are not going to be perfect. We are not perfect. But is there something that we can live with?
Maybe we bring out the problems that pop up at Thanksgiving and solve them on Constitution Day, kind of bring them back, and we have to...
Well, that's a very interesting way, but your Constitution being held hostage at Thanksgiving, you know, you have to work on that. No, it's a very interesting thing. What is it to celebrate?
Yeah, I guess it's a good question.
Yeah,
Maybe we could
no,
ask that
you
to our
ask me,
audience
now
too,
I'm asking you.
Yeah.
What is there to celebrate? How can you celebrate moderation? How are you going to celebrate shaking hands? I think that's a heck of a thing to there are several paintings of the founding.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my favorite paintings is of the New York Ratifying Convention, where Melancton Smith was a very great opponent of the Constitution, as it was until a Bill of Rights came. And Alexander Hamilton, who was very much a proponent of the Constitution and didn't think a Bill of Rights did very much at all, they shook hands. And that painting, to me, symbolizes the idea of what it is to celebrate. Can you shake hands with somebody with whom you've had great debates and great disagreements with?
So maybe that's...
And should you?
Yeah, maybe that's the way to do it. Find somebody you disagree with and shake their hand. There we go. We've just invented a celebration for Constitution Day. Well, I want to pick up on that a little bit. You talked about the importance of the deliberative process, right?
Yes.
And I think sometimes when people talk about the founding of the country, or they talk about the Constitutional Convention, they do so from a perspective that's just not right, where they'll say the founding fathers believed this. Now, there's no way. We know that, you know, they shut themselves in, right? They closed the windows. They argued. They went back and forth. They threatened to walk away. They came back. They sent it out to committees. The founding fathers agreed on almost nothing, right? There were conflicts in every aspect of the creation of the Constitution. Big states versus small states, North versus South.
You've done your reading.
I have. Well, I've known you for 11 years, so so I guess when we think about this idea, I mean, really the founding is something that this is a country that was born in a spirit of intellectual conflict, ideological conflict. So I'd love for just to hear a little bit, I mean.
But there was you want to hear a little bit about that?
Yes.
Well, I think they had one thing in common, and that they were all Whigs, which means they weren't Tories, which means they weren't monarchists. So if you start from a premise that we're declaring independence from a certain form of government and way of life. So there's a certain commonality, and that is we don't want monarchy. That is, we want to be able to choose who it is who, quote, rule us, unquote, rather than have to say, God save the king, God save the queen, and the only reason why they're in power is because their mommy and daddy were in power. So there's something fundamental in agreement. Then we disagree with who should get there. And I think if you think, so elections are important. And then there's a big fight over the election. But then we agree on the outcome. And then we go for the next election. And we go for the next election. So that I think part of my answer to your question is it starts off from an understanding of there is an agreement within which you can have disagreement. What is it that we agree on? Well, 1, no monarchy. 2, no aristocracy. That doesn't mean to say that people can't rise to the top and be wealthy and such stuff, but you earned it. You didn't get there because your mommy and daddy gave it to you. Or you could at least, today that's held to be mythological. But I think that there was a certain understanding that if you work hard, you could get to the top with luck. All this work and everything, and remember Yogi Bear said 90% depends on luck, the other half depends on work. But there's a certain sense of self-reliance, choosing that it is possible to choose the people who are going to represent you. It is possible to choose the life you're going to lead. So that fundamental choice comes in. So I think the agreement is choice. The disagreement is, what are we going to choose? That's point 1. Point 2 is there's a certain understanding an agreement among the framers that human nature is human, which means that we're not angels, which means that we're going to be naughty. But that doesn't mean to say we're beasts. So somewhere in between being angelic and being beasts, that's where the human realm lasts. Okay, now I think one of the premises that they also agree on is that faction or real nastiness is sown in the nature of human beings. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'll argue, we'll disagree, so that we agree, but we disagree, and that's part of who we are. And so what are we going to disagree about? And I think the answer is pretty much everything. So how do you manage those disagreements? I mean, how do you live in the same room? How do you do that? Well, with great difficulty. So there needs to be certain principles of things that we accept as legitimate and things that we don't. So that one of the rules that are laid down right at the convention beginning is everybody shall have the opportunity to speak before another person does. The idea of the secrecy and such not is that we shall become a team here, that we can share ideas with each other without having to be bombarded by the press or whatever it is outside. So it is, how do you build teamwork without building somehow just groupthink? So there are certain principles that are laid down. No one speaks for then. You don't write letters back and outside and seek opinion. You become part of a team. You become part of a group. But that doesn't mean to say you can't disagree within that. And I think to expect perfection is impossible. Mm-hmm. And so in the opening paragraph of the Constitution, preamble, in order to create a more perfect union, there's no understanding of creating a perfect union, because that's impossible among human beings, because there's going to be disagreement. So what is it that is more perfect than we had before? No monarchy, no permanent aristocracy, and of course the real problem for me in that whole creation is slavery. And to me, the question is, did they put slavery in the course of ultimate extinction? And for me, the answer is yes. For a lot of other people, the answer is no. And therefore, the American founding is fundamentally flawed. To shut up and let you ask another question, it is, you cannot love an ugly founding. Every country has a founding. In some sense, some kind of just fall into it. It evolves. But some, like America, had an actual founding. Mm-hmm. And a lot of new countries, independent from empires in the 20th century, had foundings. Every country in the history of the world has collapsed. I mean, that's kind of grim. Okay? Every one. I mean, I grew up under the British Empire, would never die. I had friends who taught Russian studies. They died. I have friends who have lived, who've come from Romania, who are happy to be here. And like them, I wonder, why do Americans disagree with each other so much? What's the problem? We come here, we know what it is. What is wrong with you natural-born Americans? That we know what you don't know, right? So, shut up, your turn.
Well, I want to follow up and just talk a little bit more about this notion of disagreement, because I think the way that we disagree in the present is fundamentally different in some ways than the disagreements that happen. And I want to focus on two things that you mentioned. One is kind of the nature and the depth and the thought behind the disagreement. So if you look at some of the early disagreements around the Constitution before ratification, you see it playing out in the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, right?
Yeah.
They're not tweets. These are long, very thoughtful, well-explained positions on some pretty important matters.
Yes.
And now, I mean, would you say, what can we learn about disagreement from the founders? Because now it seems like a lot of our disagreements take place in bite-sized snippets. They're not all that thoughtful. They're more angry and dismissive, and it just leads to more kind of anger and more disagreement, and it just kind of grows as opposed to being, I don't know, a public discourse. Maybe that's just, I don't know, somebody who looks to the past.
There's a lot there. There's a lot.
Yeah.
But one quick answer is, in the 20th and 21st century, politics has become war rather than deliberation. And so we become much more interested in action and less interested in, well, on the one side, on the other side, and such, and we come to see whether or not we can come to some agreement. Some of the principles that we're discussing, for example, Federalist, Anti-Federalist, we need separation of powers in the government. Okay, why? Well, because what we're used to, what is in the history of the world, is like monarchy or aristocracy, and concentration of powers, and power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Lord Acton, but that's way after the founders. But they understood that power corrupts, and so you have to check it. You have to separate it. So they agree that you should have a separation of powers between a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. They're in agreement. What do they disagree about? They disagree about, must one branch be the ultimate branch? And I think the answer is yes, they agree, but in that agreement, they get worried. Congress must be the ultimate branch. That's why you have two elections every 2 years. By the way, that's guaranteed. They both agreed on that. But one side wanted 1 year. Another side wanted 4 years. So they come to 2 years. There's nothing magical about every 2 years you have an election, because one side said, if you don't have annual elections, you don't have an election every year, tyranny begins. Power starts to corrupt. And that would be the anti-federalist position. The federalist position would be, but you can't get anything done in 1 year. You're always seeking election. You're always trying, good, exactly. You can't get anything done. It's exactly what we want. Right? But let's go for 2 years. Could we stretch the Senate maybe to 6 years? Oh, that sounds like monarchy again. That sounds like life, right? Such. So there's this argument about we need separation of powers, but how separate? And there's a myth that has grown up, and I love the myth, but it's a myth, that we have three co-equal branches. We don't have three co-equal branches, at least not from the founding perspective. Congress is the dominant branch, and it's supposed to be the dominant branch. The president has the authority to veto, but the Congress can override the veto. Okay? The judiciary has a whole set of power, but the size of the judiciary, there's nothing in the Constitution that says how many Supreme Court judges there are. Congress can set it. But we've come to have a precedent that was 7, and then there was 9, and then if you start doing that, then you're becoming corrupt. So that tradition builds into it. But Congress is as far as the Federalist is concerned, Federalist Party, Congress is the most dangerous branch, and there's nothing that we can do, whatever the separation of powers is that Congress is going to be dominant, or should be dominant, and then we have to be careful about that. The anti-federalists are saying, but you know what? Once you start playing with 4-year terms for the presidency, etc., they're going to start thinking like monarchs. And then you have a character like George Washington who said, I'm going to put a stop to that. George Washington could have been reelected and reelected even in death, right? But he chose to only have 2 terms. Now that set a precedent. And that is so if you look at the Constitution, it's not just a bundle of compromises. The anti-federalists are in there. The Federalists are in there. What did the anti-federalists want? They wanted representation for the states. Okay. Are the states represented? In the Senate, equally. Much to the alarm of a whole bunch of people who say, why should North Dakota, why should there even be 2 Dakotas? I don't even know why they should have 1. but and then they have 4 votes, and California only has 2. That's not fair. It's not democratic, but it is federal. Mm-hmm. And Madison would cringe and whatnot. But all right, but if we can make it for 6 years, then we're getting the purpose of the Senate as a restraining branch. And then the anti-federalists said, no, that's too long. So you've got this argument, where do the states fit in? And how long should the representatives serve? And how close should they be to the people? And one thing, bless them both, in the U.S. Constitution, they didn't have recall. Okay, they did. They didn't have recall. That is a progressive understanding of politics that came in the late 19th century, early 20th century to have the recall. So there's no recall. But I think what has happened is that as politics have become more complicated, and life has become more complicated, we want action, and the presidency has grown, and the judiciary has grown, and Congress doesn't see. Let me just give you one example, and then back to you for your question. What bothers me a heck of a lot is why isn't being a U.S. senator good enough? I mean, it seems to me that's an admirable thing to be, not only because you're there for 6 years. But it's admirable. But within the last 20 years, it seems to be a stepping stone to the vice presidency or the presidency for both political parties. Why isn't it good enough? Why must Biden, for example, be senator for ages, want to be vice president? Why did Lyndon Johnson want to be vice president, unless it's a stepping stone to the presidency? But what is it about the presidency? What's wrong with being a senator? And I think that goes to the heart of the republic for which we stand. You want to talk about what is different from a republic from something else. It's not a monarchy. Whatever a republic is, it's not a monarchy. And the only way which monarchy can enter into the American system, it seems to me, is through the presidency. And the presidency is needed clearly in times of war, but if everything becomes war, I'm not just talking about war in Afghanistan, Second World War. We have war on poverty, war on illiteracy, a war on masks, a war without masks. So that war, how can you deliberate and settle differences if it's war? You take prisoners. And that is the greatest danger it seems to me, to the deliberative process that underlies the Constitution, which created the Constitution through deliberation. The states are represented. You got 2 years, not 1. You got 2 years, not 4. You got such and such. So within that, you've got a mechanism in which both sides can live, but requires good faith to make it work.
Do you think there's a way to get from the war approach to almost every issue? Every issue is a war zone, right? Online, the way we talk about them, if you believe a little bit of this, then you're, I mean, the way we kind of categorize and dismiss other people, their arguments, that sort of thing, is very much that war metaphor, right? If you're not 100% with me, then you're against me. I was reading a book recently, and they talked about a good negotiation is where both parties walk away, and neither one is happy, but they can accept the result. Are we at a place in the present day where we can get back to a deliberative process where people can accept it even if they're not happy? Or is there kind of a purity of the way that we approach politics and these big issues that have faced our country for a long time?
So I think that's a very good question, and I think it's a very difficult question to answer. How do you stand on principle and yet compromise? It's very difficult. And I think we've just that statement, your question and my response, says we're human. Not every issue is a matter of salvation, I think. But there's a certain morality which has entered, I think, our life, which is if something is wrong and you don't act on it, and you act on it to solve it immediately, you are a hypocrite. To call somebody a hypocrite these days is probably one of the worst things you can do. So that you're pushing people that if there's a principle, that you have to live with it, live it out, act it out. And because unless you act it out completely, then you're being hypocritical and you're not living on accordance of principle. Well, maybe that's for angels. But human life and human condition, not presented with that kind of simple, I wish life were that simple. But that life isn't that simple, right?
Yeah.
It's not that simple. So we have to make certain adjustments. And as old Aristotle would argue, is there something called political morality, which seems to me these days, your point is, can you be political and moral at the same time? And Aristotle would say, yeah, there's something called prudence. And political morality, what is a politician? Getting something done. What is a utopian? Doing the best. What's a real statesman? Doing the best that is possible. And that's so difficult because mere politicians just get it done, kick the can down the road, I've got it done. Utopians have visions of all kinds of things, that they want the world to be good, and I am the world, and I want to make a difference, and all of that. It's all great. But there's this huge area of life in which not everything is disgusting and not everything is perfect. And how do you live within that range? And I think that's what the framers have bequeathed to us. A constitution teaches us in some way to live within that range. What is the danger? We step outside that range. If we step outside that range, then we become utopian or disgusting. And it's very difficult. And the more you go into war, the more you're going to pay. War does not necessarily bring out the best in us. It brings out the best in us in terms of the veterans and sacrifice and joining and serving your country. Absolutely. But in terms of trying to persuade the people who are not in uniform, but are out there, what do you do? Well, you paint your enemy you don't paint your enemy in the most pleasant terms. Often you paint your enemy in disgusting terms. And that's something that war does. I mean, it's your enemy. You can't be nice. Oh, you can't. draw a nice cartoon about your enemy. It's a nasty person. You're going to fight them, and your soldiers, and they're out there doing it, and you have to support the troops. But throughout life, there's been the painting of the enemy as somebody nasty. Well, yes, that's going to happen. Well, okay, but what if war becomes the norm within domestic politics? Then you're presenting each other as not as patriots, not as Americans, but as an enemy. And then you're going to say nasty things about them. Why aren't you going to say nasty things? That's what war does. So in one sense, war brings the best in us in heroism, which we honor in Veterans Day, which we honor in Memorial Day, which we honor, and so we should. But war also, if it, as I say, brings out sometimes not best, which we then have regrets about, because why should I be at war with you? You and I may disagree. I haven't found it yet. You want me to?
No.
But you and I may disagree. But I don't feel as if tonight, I mean, we may disagree in the crowd, but I don't feel as if we're going to go in the car and say, that damn Lloyd, I tell you something, I would not like to put a knife in him or something or the other. Oh gosh, exactly. How can you live in a democracy and have a conversation and with deliberation if you don't say, oh gosh, blood is going to be spilled? When do you have your self-control? Which I don't have.
Well, we've talked a lot about some big ideas. I want to get back into, I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the interesting stories that come out of the founding of the country and the Constitution, because as you said, it was not founded by these kind of marble statues in a museum, but by men who lived and breathed and had all sorts of different peccadillos and interesting stories behind them. Are there, as we think about the Constitution and the folks who wrote it, are there any interesting stories or particular kind of favorites? If you were going to put together your constitutional Mount Rushmore, we already have a Mount Rushmore with presidents, but now I want you to put together kind of a Mount Rushmore of, as you think about Constitution Day, here's 4 people that you would put up there for you should think about and learn more about them, either because they're interesting, because of their contributions. Who's on your constitutional Mount Rushmore? We'll call it Mount Lloyd.
Now, I don't necessarily have to like them, do I?
No. You can respect them without liking them. It's a good lesson.
And because they may be influential, and at the same time not necessarily likable, but I have to live with them. Okay, my big 4 would be, Madison, obviously. Suffered through a whole bunch of things, and one of my favorite stories is that Patrick Henry was selected to go to the Constitutional Convention by Virginia, and he didn't want to go because apparently he smelt a rat. And the rat, of course, was that they were going to strengthen reduce the power of the states and increase the continental or the union, more perfect union, less role for the states. And Patrick Henry didn't like that. He smelt a rat. So that when Patrick Henry dropped out, there was a vacancy in the Virginia delegation. And the story has it that James Madison managed to get Dr. McClurg, who had no experience in politics whatsoever, but was an interested citizen, as we should have. I mean, that's another thing we could talk about, is what is the relationship between those whom we choose and those ourselves? How much does civic education play a part in keeping this thing going? Or do we just turn it over to politicians and just say, well, every 2 years we do something? But how involved should we be? And how knowledgeable before we get involved should we be? But Madison had this guy, James McClurg, who was a doctor, and he managed to get McClurg chosen to go to the convention. The question is why? Well, low ground. Regularly in life, there's a low ground answer and there's a high ground answer. And somehow life is somewhere in between, one hopes. And the low ground answer is because Madison was a hypochondriac. He's 5'2", always dressed in black, thought he was going to die any moment, and outlived everybody, which is why he was called the father of the Constitution. Okay? This guy, but so Dr. McClurg was there to attend to him. Right? And he didn't need any attention. He stayed up all night writing notes and then doing everything. And, right? But anyway, so Dr. McClurg's wife wrote to Dr. McClurg and said, listen, there are patients back here in Virginia who are suffering. Could you please come home and take care of them? And stop with that Mr. Madison over there. He's just fine. So that's one of my stories. I put not McClurg on that Mount Lloyd, but I put Madison.
But McClurg's behind him, so we can.
Oh yeah. Right. He's the shadow. Yeah. That's right. He's there. Yeah.
Even cast in stone. Yeah. Madison's hypochondriac. Okay.
That's right. We had. That's the time when doctors used to actually visit you. They didn't have to go to a clinic. He's right there. A second person whom I put there would be a guy called Roger Sherman. A tank wasn't named after him. That's another one. Roger Sherman, you should really follow him. Roger Sherman is the only person who signed the Declaration of Independence, signed the Articles of Confederation, signed the Constitution, signed on behalf of Connecticut, the ratifying of the Constitution, and was there at the end in the first Congress and signed the Bill of Rights. The only one of all the founders who did that. And yet, there are very few stories about him. He was a snake. People realize that. He was there all the time, and he was, right? If you're there all the time like that, you're going to have some influence, aren't you? And Madison had to deal with Sherman all the time. Madison introduced this proposal that we should strengthen the Union, have a more perfect Union. And Sherman said, well, what about the states? And Sherman managed to get the votes and stop him. And that's where you had the New Jersey Plan, which Sherman really wrote. So that this is a huge battle at the convention where some people say, well, nothing happened. Why should I read for 1 hour, for one whole month? Why should I read? And nothing happened. You got Madison with the Virginia Plan. You got Sherman with the opposite, and nothing happened. Why should I bother to read that? Isn't that life? You ever been to committee meetings? You ever been to negotiations? There are periods of time when nothing happens. So who blinks? Or did somebody say, you know, I really got to go home? What will it take to shut you up? Right? What will it take? And so, well, I have a proposal. And they spent a lot of time, these guys, in taverns afterwards. With a lot of negotiation. So don't you think over a couple of drinks they could say, well, look, if you bend on that and I bend on this, you get your folks to do this, you get your folks to do that, we could make it work. But so Madison is here, and Sherman is here, and they came together. And what is known as the Connecticut Compromise, which is really the Sherman Compromise, Connecticut. Madison hated it. And what was the vote? 6-5-1. New York had left, and Rhode Island never showed up. So it's 6-5-1. How is that a compromise? When I think of compromise, I think of consensus. But how can it be what? A compromise is that there's something in there in which you accept the outcome. And that's a different way of looking at compromise. I'd never looked at it before I started studying this. Compromise is not just, I have a deal for you, you have a deal for this. But it's at the end is, what do I do if I lose? What if I'm part of the 5 and not part of the 6? Do I walk out or do I go on? And that was a Madison decision. He went on, right? And so Sherman Sherman managed to secure the role of the states in the Constitution. Okay.
So we got Madison here, we got Sherman on the other side, because they're on the two opposite sides.
Exactly, and to bring them together is that in the first Congress, Madison introduces the Bill of Rights. And he says, well, look, there are a lot of people out there who want this. I think separation of powers is more important to protecting rights. But all right, I will introduce it. What I want to do, Madison says, is I want to open up the Constitution, and I want to put this right here, that's right there, this right there, this right there, and close the Constitution again. And then we should pat it down, so we will not have the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. We'll have the Constitution, in which we've now incorporated the Bill of Rights. And Sherman is there, and he says, no, you're not going to do that. We cannot touch the work of the framers. We have to put this Bill of Rights as amendments at the end of the Constitution. And Madison says, I am the framer.
I was there.
I was there. I did it. You opposed me all the way. And now, darn it, you're opposing me again. So Sherman.
Okay, so we got two. We need two more. Let's put them on the outside because they were oppositional. Who's in the middle?
All right, bad guy first and then good guy last.
Okay, I like it.
Bad guy would be Rutledge, John Rutledge of South Carolina. The South Carolina delegation was the only delegation in which every single member went every day of the 88 days. Others came and went because they had quorum requirements, so as long as you had, say, 4, the other 2 could go off and do business and come back, and etc. But South Carolina, so far away, they decided to stay. Their one issue was slavery. So you get a committee that's created to put the first draft of the Constitution together. And it's called a Committee on Detail. And on that committee, you have 5 people. 1 from Massachusetts, 1 from Pennsylvania, 1 from Virginia, 3 big states, majority of the population. 1 from Connecticut, Sherman.
Of course. Snake.
And 1 left over. And at that time, at that moment, the issue was, well, we've settled a lot of it, but we haven't really dealt with slavery. So South Carolina gets on that committee, and Rutledge is the chair. And he comes out with the most, what's in that committee report is that the slave trade, which they equated with slavery, the continuation of slavery, is that the slave trade, Congress shall never have the power to control the slave trade ever. That is Rutledge's position. The committee says, okay, let's go and hear what the entire body of the convention has to say about that one issue. And Madison is furious with that. And Madison manages to create another committee in which that one issue of whether Congress shall ever control the slave trade has come. And Madison wants Congress to be able to control the slave trade right away. And they compromise on 1800. Madison bends. Prudence, stupidity, hypocrisy, he bends to 1800. Argument, is there an argument? Yes. New century, new beginning. Mm-hmm. The committee agrees. Comes back, 1800. South Carolina delegation, led by Rutledge. How about 1808? Why 1808? 20 years, generation. We can't live without it, but perhaps the next generation can live without slavery. And the vote is taken. And Madison is furious. Why? Because he wants it to go, he's willing to bend to 1800, but he's not willing to bend to 1808. And he loses. Rutledge is the one who manages to get that in. And he says, well, let's say you look at Article 5 of the Constitution, which is that this is how you amend the Constitution. But the Constitution cannot be amended in the following way. There shall be no end to the slave trade until 1808. Right? So Rutledge gets that in there. And Sherman says, oh, really? Is that right? I'll tell you what then. No state can be deprived of its equal representation in the Senate ever. And that gets into the Article 5 of the Constitution, which is the Amendment 1. And so Rutledge, I think, is an extremely important person beyond Mount Lloyd, because he is the one who is responsible for that 1808 clause in there. And because of that, we have now interpreted the framers as wanting slavery to exist forever. The vote was something like 6 to 4. Mm-hmm. Again, somebody else had left, right? It was like, oh no, 6-4-1, Massachusetts divided. Now that is not exactly, to me, an overwhelming support for, but we must move on. As we must move on. We've got 3. 4th one, Gouverneur Morris.
He's a fun one.
Not governor, Gouverneur. His mom was French, from which he got the French name Gouverneur. Long history about him. One of the story, and he's probably the one most responsible for writing the preamble to the Constitution. So he's got to be up there for that. But he's got to be up there because he's an incredible figure. Tall, women liked him. He was a bachelor. And there's a story in Philadelphia, and it's a true one. And he's in a carriage on one of these cobblestone streets, and he happens to have in his company the wife of a very prominent fellow in Philadelphia. And this prominent chap in Philadelphia is not particularly tolerant of such behavior. And so he runs up to the carriage, and Gouverneur Morris decides it's time to get out of here. So he jumps out of the carriage, and problems happen to his leg, among other things. And so he gets a peg leg, and you will see often in paintings him with his peg leg. Sometimes it's with his left leg, sometimes it's with his right leg, but he's got a peg leg there.
It's tough to keep it straight.
He's got to keep it right. And John Jay, who wasn't at the convention, was in New York and heard about this poor accident that Gouverneur Morris had. He says, I actually think that you should have lost something else in the accident. So there's a nice story about Gouverneur Morris. Thomas Jefferson wasn't at the convention. He was the ambassador in France. And Madison had written to him and said, we got to get, this is troublesome. And Jefferson said about the Massachusetts revolt and the Shays Rebellion and whatnot. And Jefferson said a little bit of spilling of blood now and again is all right. Until the French Revolution came, and he said, "Can I come home?" And so Washington said, "Well, who am I going to send in place of Jefferson?" Gouverneur Morris. His mother's French. So Gouverneur Morris becomes the ambassador to France for the United States. Apparently, he is in a carriage with a married woman in France.
He didn't learn the first time.
No. His peg leg didn't stop him none. To adapt the Paul Simon song, right? Yeah. And so he's in this carriage with a married woman, and it's during the French Revolution. And he said it's a splendid carriage. Everything lasts for. I mean, if you want to see Gouverneur Morris's peg leg, I think it's in the New York Historical Society library. It's up there. You can't touch it. It's behind a screen. You know, you got, ooh, a peg leg. Yeah. I don't know what story they've told. Probably not the correct one.
Yeah.
Cleaned it up. but so the Paris mob, you know, the people, they decide they're going to go after this aristocratic carriage. They didn't know this ambassador from the United States is there. They go out and they shake the carriage, and you know, you aristocrats. And story has it, Gouverneur Morris takes his peg leg off and says, "I lost it in the Revolution." And they gave him an escort out of town. So he's got to be up there on Mount Lloyd.
Yeah, yeah. That's quite a Mount Lloyd. Quite a Mount Lloyd. You didn't know I was throwing that at you. That's
No, I hadn't heard of that mountain. The 2 L's or 1 L's?
However you want it to be.
Is it a first name or a last name?
We might rename it at some point. So.
That's right. Lloyd Mount. No,
Yeah.
no.
Well, I want to give our audience, I'm looking at our time, I want to give our audience a chance if they have any questions for Dr. Lloyd, and I know he's going to be signing those books at the end, but we have staff members who have microphones, so if anybody has a question, just raise your hand and they will come to you. We got a question right here in the front.
This is for you.
This is they don't want to ask me the questions.
Hi, Dr. Lloyd. So I wanted to ask, 2 centuries later, do you think the Constitution should be modernized to better suit the modern American people?
You know, no. Angela and I went to see a show. I wanted to see it badly, so did she. And it's called What the Constitution Means to Me. What the Constitution Means to Me. And it's a one Pulitzer Prize and everything. But the very way of putting that is the emphasis is on me. I cannot go so far as to say that the question should be, what do I mean to the Constitution? But certainly think one should stop saying what the Constitution means to me. Because the Constitution is about us, we the people, not me, this simple individual of sort of. So one answer is that I give to you is no, I don't think it needs to be modernized, brought up to date, because we are somehow a different people in that sense. I think the Constitution, we need to remember that human nature really doesn't change. That we still have faction, we still quarrel, we still have disputes. How do we resolve those disputes? I think the Constitution reminds us that we need to control ourselves in some fashion. I shiver a little bit when I hear, it doesn't matter which president, is it Biden, Trump, whatever, presidents start thinking that they can issue edicts of any kind without any deliberation that has taken place. So that I don't think the Constitution needs to be modernized in the sense of make it more relevant to me, which was your first point, I think. The second is I don't think the Constitution needs to be modernized to make it possible so that a president of any party can issue edicts, which makes it more relevant because we have a problem, because after all, we're at war. But this show that we watched really brings together a lot about what your question is getting at. And it involves not just the Constitution, but what the Supreme Court says about the Constitution. And I happen to be one of those people who doesn't think the Constitution is what the Supreme Court says it is. I think the Constitution is what the deliberate sense of the community says it is. And the best way that that deliberate sense of the community is expressed is through the amendment to the Constitution. You can't get much more deliberate than 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the state legislatures or the people. That is pretty much deliberate, sort of, right. So I'm not a fan, whether it be liberal or conservative, I'm not a fan of the Supreme Court's being the final arbiter of what the Constitution is. I'm very happy that we passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the Constitutions with regard to slavery, because that overturned a Supreme Court decision. So I think that again puts emphasis on the civic responsibility, not just of what the Constitution means to me, but how do we as a civic community protect the Constitution from becoming simply politicized? Because now the Supreme Court is, well, your 3 people or my 3 people? Your 3 people or my 3 people? But this show was trying to suggest that the Constitution, a woman's right to an abortion, for example, should the Constitution be made more relevant because, after all, it was written by men and not by women. If it were written by women, it would be different. Well, you can amend it. You can change it. I mean, you don't even need to amend things. You can just deliberate sense of the community change it. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but what I'm trying to get at is that, in a sense, it's a wrong question. In the sense of saying that what does this marriage mean to me? I mean, that's not necessarily the right question to ask. Kennedy said to John F. Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Well, I'm not about to go so far as to say, ask not what your Constitution could do for you, what you can do for your Constitution, because that would sort of be a denial of freedom. But I'm saying, if we approach the Constitution as, I follow it, I understand it, I'll do with it, as long as it is relevant to me as I define myself, then constitutionalism it doesn't mean anything. I'll leave it at that. I don't know if I've answered your question. But it won a prize.
That's
and
the
therefore your
thing.
question is not, therefore your question is extremely important because it won a prize. And yet, what I have to like about that show is that it was advocating the Constitution needs to be fundamentally altered because it is irrelevant for answering fundamental personal questions that particularly a woman has to go through today, that abortion, which is right back in the news again, Supreme Court, right back in the news again about that. I mean, I believe that if a deliberate sense of the community settles things, we're highly unlikely to have disputes. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed by a majority of Democrats, a majority of Republicans in the House, a majority of Democrats, a majority of Republicans in the Senate, and it passed. And no one has really argued about civil rights since, in my opinion. What they've argued about is affirmative action. I've argued about this, that, and the other. But the basic that was a basic deliberate sense of the community. Supreme Court, it didn't come out as an edict. It didn't come out as an order. It didn't come as a presidential directive or a Supreme Court order. It came out as the deliberate sense of the community, not through amendment or through community. So but it won a prize. And that's what I think is we've forgotten a deliberate sense of the community. That's what I would say.
Let's see, we have another time for maybe another question or two. Let's go to Tyler here.
I just had like a really quick question, but what made you interested in studying the U.S. Constitution? Was it like kind of like how unique it was and it had never happened before. It's kind of just a simple question, but I was wondering what made you want to study that.
I'm an immigrant. I didn't understand why Americans quarrel with each other. I didn't understand why I loved the country and how the people in the country who were born here didn't like it quite as much as I did. And I didn't understand it. Then I went into economics, and I didn't understand that either. I did my Ph.D. in economics at Chicago, and I said, this ain't for me. And it turned out what I was interested in economics was things like Adam Smith and thinkers and those who deliberated and did nothing except think. And there was an author called Charles Beard, who's extremely influential author, progressive author, and he wrote a book called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, in which his whole point was we don't study the Constitution as ideas. We don't study it in deliberative process and who are the four going to go on Mount Lloyd. What we ask is, who was rich? What assets did they have? What such and such? So he compiled an economic sort of map about who owned stocks, who owned bonds, who owned such and such. And as a result of that knowledge, we could understand the Constitution. We didn't need to understand 88 days of debates. We know it exactly. So I thought, that's a bit odd. That's all you have to do in life? You don't have to go through arguments anymore and wrestle with them. All you need to do is how much of your worth? Or, as it comes down the line, what's the color of your skin? Or what's your gender? And once that key is then we figure out everything. We don't need to bother with this, one hand and the other hand and the such and such and such and such. We got the key to life. So studying economics and thinking that that's what I really wanted to study, that kind of thought, reflection, not second derivatives of some mathematical formula. I decided, well, let me study Charles Beard. So I studied Beard more, and the more I studied Beard, the more I realized I needed to get into the actual debates of the Constitution itself. And that's how I got in. And so now I don't agree with Beard's interpretation.
Excellent. I think we have one in the back there.
You're going to hold it. Okay. Thanks a lot. You mentioned early on in your talk that forming the Constitution was a bloodless type of event. I would take issue. I'm sorry.
No. Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah. Early on in your talk, I think you mentioned that the Founding Fathers in forming the Constitution was a bloodless act. And I would take issue with that, called the Revolutionary War. So that's my comment. But my question is that in the context of the Congress being a very powerful institution, or maybe the most powerful, I would wonder why the Founding Fathers didn't install term limits. Because if they didn't want a monarchy, why not say 6 years or 12 years or whatever, and then limit it? Yeah. That's my question.
Okay, well, let me make the comment that I wasn't implying that the entire founding was bloodless. What I was suggesting that the creation of the Constitution over those 88 days and then the ratification, whole government stopped and not a drop of blood was spilled. 1776 was a lot of blood being spilled. And one of the interesting questions could be, how do we turn from killing to talking? So how do we come from 1776 to 1787? Why did they not want term limits? The Anti-Federalists did. Annual elections, where annual elections end, tyranny begins. And then they had rotation in office. If you take a look at all the state constitutions at that time, only Massachusetts, and I think New York tried it, had the election of the governor by the people, by the state legislatures, and they had rotation in office. So the old Whig idea, I mean Whig here, Tory monarchy over here. The old Whig idea was term limits, yes. Rotation in office, yes. We do not want you to become professional politicians. We want you to go back and go back to the farm. I think Madison took issue with that. And his issue was that you do not develop a competent government that way. And so what Madison and Hamilton argue is that you have to attract people of quality to go to office, to go and serve. And the only way to attract their interest is by having them go there for at least 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. I mean, why go and become a senator if you're only going to be there for 1 or 2 years and then you're rotated out? It's not attractive to become a senator. So I think there is a debate. I mean, let's say both sides are interested in liberty. Both sides, therefore, are Whigs. The question is, where does the danger to liberty come from? The Anti-Federalists would say, the longer a person is in office and the more the same person can be reelected, the danger, because then they start to forget you. They start to be interested in themselves and build their own career. Madison's response is, they don't have to be that way. You always have the election. Madison placed an incredible amount of, perhaps too much, faith in the ability of the people to choose and rotate themselves. For example, what one might argue, think about it. I was just thinking about this now. The first time we had term limits on presidents was after Roosevelt served 4 terms. Before then, it was sort of understood because Washington set an example. Two terms. And so it was self-rotating, self-limiting as a president, exactly. And then Roosevelt, so that, I mean, one might say, well, but how arrogant of that generation of the 1930s, 1940s to tell us we couldn't have a third term of Reagan, or we couldn't have a third term of Clinton, or we couldn't have a third term of Bush. I mean, why can't we decide for ourselves whether we want to do that? Well, of course, we could always overturn the amendment, which we did with Prohibition. So we could always overturn that amendment. I think the main response I will give you is that the Anti-Federalists were concerned with what you're raising. They definitely were. And the state constitutions show it. Madison thought that you have to attract decent people. So not only do you have civic responsibility, but you have to be able to develop not necessarily a class of people, but certainly, I mean, Madison and Jefferson set up University of Virginia with the express purpose of teaching statesmanship. That you just don't get people into office by a wand. So that's why they would disagree with the Anti-Federalists. And their point is you have to attach the interest of the person with the constitutional office. Why would somebody become interested in a part-time job? And I think the Anti-Federalist response is, I'd rather that, thank you very much, and take my chances.
Excellent. We might have time for one more audience question. We have another one over here, looks like.
It's getting dark.
Thank you, Dr. Lloyd. My question is this. when Madison spoke about freedom of expression, was he speaking strictly about freedom of religion?
No. I think that, interesting, if you peel everything off and you say to both Jefferson and Madison, give me your 4 top, or 3, let's say 4. Your Mount Jefferson, your Mount Madison, 4 biggies of rights or freedoms. One would be freedom of conscience. For both of them, number 1, freedom of conscience. That is the right to be able to worship God as you see fit, not as the monarch sees fit or as the church sees fit, but as you see fit, and then it fits into the churches. But not, it doesn't come on from on high. So freedom of conscience. Freedom of the press, within which is linked in those days to like freedom of speech. Because the way in which you communicated was essentially through the press, the newspapers. So yes, speech and press together are really one. That's number 2. Number 3, and those are very, very American. Those come out of the Revolution, and those come out of blood. Yes, then there's a British tradition, which is due process of law. Counsel, trial, etc. That is American, but it's very Western tradition. But the British didn't have freedom of conscience. That's why the people came over here. Right? They didn't, and the 4th one was the right to choose the form of government under which you live, which means guaranteed elections. The British, still today, Boris Johnson can call an election pretty much whenever he wants to. Or if there's war, you can perhaps postpone it for a little bit. Not here. Constitution, written down. What the Constitution means for me is I have every year a guarantee of every second year an election. I wish it were 1, but it got it 2. Or in a president, 4. By the way, why did they call the elections coming up in 2022? Why do they call it midterm or off year? That shows the incredible capacity of journalists and intellectuals to think that the presidential election is the only one that matters. What's that? Why should it be? No, I didn't hear what you said.
I said it's called the midterm election because it's tied to the most important election.
Who has decided that that is the most important election? I know, but that was not what I was getting at. That is not necessarily the most important institution at the time of the founding. It has become so, particularly through war. So now we even relegate. So that's why a senator wants to become a president. But so those would be the big 4. Okay. Where does expression come in? I think that's the 20th century, 21st terminology that you won't find the word expression. Well, literally, you won't find the word expression in the First Amendment. Freedom of conscience. See, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of fair trial, British tradition, and the freedom to choose the form of government under which you live, which implies regular elections which are guaranteed. Come war, come peace. And then that really raises the question that's been going on here. Is a constitution only good for peacetime? Because think about it, if we're all at war all the time against this pestilence and that disease and this problem, why do we need a constitution? So I think those are the big 4. And then when we get to, but there are others, but those are sort of big 4. And when you get to Roosevelt and in World War II, those four are basically reduced to two, conscience and then speech, and two added. And sort of safety and jobs. And the first two, see, this is fascinating. And it really raises the question, what does the Constitution have to say about what the role of government is in our lives? And which level of government? Because we got state governments and we got federal government. But or do we call it the national government? Or do we call it the general government? So the Constitution is a sort of a statement of what should the government do? And once you get to the New Deal, and you get beyond the New Deal, then rights are not necessarily completely against what the government, like right of conscience, right of speech, but a right to expect from the government. And the Great Society program added some more. Beauty. We have a right to beauty. Nice gardens, other things. That one didn't go over too well. The word expression, I think, is the 20th century, 21st century expression, which you won't find. So if you want to say, I think it involves both conscience, but I think even more it involves speech, which is related to petitioning and discussing and deliberation, not just speech in terms of expression, in terms of, oh, I feel like this, therefore I want to do it, therefore I'm an American and I have a First Amendment right to express myself. That's not what Madison is getting at. I don't think Madison would have much of would lose much sleep even because he had Dr. McClurg there. But he wouldn't lose much sleep. But he wouldn't lose much sleep over that kind of autonomy, let's say. I mean, isn't silence wonderful?
After 88 days of deliberation, you need to...
You know what they did after 88 days of deliberation?
Oh, I know. I've seen your website.
They went to the city tavern.
And how did they celebrate Constitution Day?
With a very good constitution.
Yeah, one of my favorite documents from the founding. If you look at the website, the bill from the city tavern, and it's very, it's a line item.
You see, yeah, you should, yeah. I found in the 1980s, I was very fortunate to go and help with the Miracle at Philadelphia 200th anniversary of the Constitution. And I worked in the first, volunteered in the first bank. I was very fortunate to have association with one of the curators there. When curating means helping build up this rather than making it fit what you want for a lesson plan. I was very fortunate, and these boxes, they're still there, I believe. Boxes, and they're not even documented. But in there, I found the bill for the city tavern. And then the framers celebrated their bill. I mean, the work that they did, and the amount of punch and whiskey and things that were consumed, and it was hardly anything eaten. And then there was a bill for musicians. And the musicians' bill was there. See, you want to talk about non-aristocracy, non-monarchy? We pay, right? Oh, there's another example. You want to talk about a difference between the ancient world? That's an expression. We pay our representatives. It's not just simply a public service. We pay them. So these musicians get paid. And the top one, I mean, you should read the names. They're all German. And I'm wondering, what the heck is all these German names? And so one of the beauties of the web, is that you can actually, people can write in and communicate with you. Say, well, what do you know about this person here? I say, I have no idea what this person is. But why don't you, this guy who writes me happens to be very interested in genealogy. And he tells me this is his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather who came from Hanover, and he was part of the British Hanoverians to fight in 1776, and all the musicians are German, and they were all prisoners until the end of the war in 1783, and then they had a choice. They could go back to Germany. No, they decided to stay in America, become Americans. And here they are 4 years later, playing at the farewell dinner. I mean, how American is that?
Very American.
It is?
At
Right.
the celebration of the Constitution, having your
Celebration
vanquished
of the Constitution
foes
by immigrants playing for you.
playing music for your entertainment.
That's right.
That's the best way to celebrate Constitution Day. So with that, we're going to wrap up. We're going to say thank you so much, Dr. Lloyd. We appreciate it. A little gift on behalf of the foundation.
Thank you. And to refer to the preamble, and people have asked me, where do I get this sort of blessing from? It's from the preamble, the blessings of liberty upon you. You know, it does. It's right from the preamble of the Constitution. Thank you very much for coming.
Absolutely. And Dr. Lloyd is going to be signing copies of his books.